Hey guys, this is our lecture on the American Revolution. I'm not going to read through all these slides as you can read, but you should read through them on your own. Like I said, the objectives are the main ideas that I take test questions from, and specifically I look for discussion questions that address these objectives. A lot of these people and things are things that you've heard of, but specifically read through the definitions anyway, especially popular sovereignty. This is something that we'll talk about in class some as well. Yorktown, we're going to see that portrayed in the movie if we get to go that far with the movie. And the goal for this unit, for me anyway, is to hopefully connect the Enlightenment with the founding of the United States. The 1700s, Britain was a global superpower. That's the term that we would use today. Had lots of wealth, had lots of trade connections, lots of ships, which would be important in a war, especially if you're fighting one away from your home country as they were. George III came to power in 1760, and we talked about enlightened kings. He believed in some of the Enlightenment ideas. However, he was still attempting to hold on and consolidate his own power. One of the things that you see here is he dissolved the cabinet system and attempted to make Parliament subject to him, which is the opposite of the way England had been operating since the Glorious Revolution. You've seen maps like this before. This is the 13 colonies. They were doing fairly well by this time. Most of them had economies based on trade with England and other countries. But one of the problems that we're going to see in the run-up to the Revolution is that England attempted to control who the colonies could trade with. And specifically, they wanted to make sure that the colonies traded with England first, and England wanted to some extent control prices that they were paying. Wars in Europe and the Americas, specifically the French and Indian War, is one that we talked a little bit about. Britain had a lot of debt. They attempted to pay back that debt. They raised money. We've talked about this many times. Governments collect money. They get money through taxes. And I've just listed a couple of the taxes here. The Sugar Act was a tax on sugar, obviously. The Stamp Act was a tax on most paper, newspapers, pamphlets, that kind of stuff, as well as legal documents. And in 1766, this was not a tax, but it basically, the Declaratory Act basically said that England had complete and total power over the colonies. And then down at the bottom, I've listed the phrase, no taxation without representation. There were violent disagreements. I used the word clashes there that broke out in the colonies. You had in 1770, we talked about the Boston Massacre. We'll talk a little bit about the Boston Tea Party. There was a move in England to harshly punish the colonists for these, especially the Tea Party, because that was the Boston Massacre wasn't much of a loss for Britain, but the Tea Party was a pretty significant loss because we're talking about tons and tons of tea that was dumped into Boston Harbor. 1775 was when the war officially started. What I mean by that is there were hostilities with guns on both sides, not just like the Boston Massacre. The battles of Lexington and Concord were the first, and we'll talk a little bit about them. George Washington was the commander of the army. We talked about the fact that he cut his teeth, so to speak. He learned to fight during the French and Indian War, suffered a couple of significant defeats, but he was able to learn from those, and that made him a very good leader. Thomas Jefferson, I think most of us probably know, was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, and we've talked already about the fact that he leaned heavily on the ideas of John Locke. This idea that I'll have at the bottom called popular sovereignty, that says that government power comes from the people. This is something that is totally and completely new at this point in history. The fact that power comes from the people is just completely and utterly new. Up until this point, the power comes from the military, the person who has, like we've said, the most sharp sticks, the most guns, the most people who are loyal to him and were willing to fight for him. The Americans had a major disadvantage. They didn't have a whole lot in the way of military stuff. You can read that guns, you can read that leaders. They were at a major military disadvantage. They didn't have much money to pay the soldiers, and even more specifically, they didn't have a plan other than to defeat the English. The British had a massive navy, they had a huge army, and they had a lot of money. However, George Washington figured out a few advantages that he could exploit in order to help the Americans. They were fighting on familiar terrain. This is home court advantage is a good way to look at that. In a football game, basketball game, whatever it is, they were fighting at home. They had really good leaders. He picked good leaders to be under him. And then the other thing is that they had this thought that they were fighting for something. That they weren't just fighting to defend their homes or whatever. There was this ideal that they were fighting for. They wanted freedom. They really needed some assistance from other countries, but there were other countries that were reluctant to join just because they didn't know how it was going to turn out. But Americans won the Battle of Saratoga, and at that point, France decided to jump in the war. And a good way to look at this is France and Britain had not been getting along for quite a while. They had fought a couple of wars, and you've probably heard the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." And that's pretty much how France looked at the Americas. They thought they saw an opportunity to jump in and actually defeat the British. And soon after that, the Netherlands and Spain joined. But the French had a pretty significant impact on the outcome of the war. 1781, we've jumped to the end of the war. The French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, and the Americans defeated the British soundly at Yorktown, Virginia. And hopefully, if we get to see the end of the movie, we'll see that scene where the French fleet arrives. 1783, 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and then Britain reluctantly recognized that the United States of America did exist. The Articles of Confederation was the first government that the United States had, but it was entirely too weak. It didn't even have the power to force states to raise taxes. So they had to come up with something else. There was a Constitutional Convention, started in 1787. You see the name George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and quite a few others. That names that you would recognize were there. The original goal was to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, but they actually ended up creating a new constitution. It created a federal government, which basically just means that under federalism, the power is divided between states and a central government. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution after it was written because there were people that still felt the central government would be too powerful without the Bill of Rights added in. And we're going to talk specifically about the Bill of Rights pretty soon. Finally, in 1789, the Constitution was officially adopted, and the country of America as we know it today was officially began as the type of government that we have now. 3 branches. You have the legislative, executive, and judicial, and we will spend some time talking a little bit about that at the end of this unit.